Alright, so we're picking up to the end of the last chapter where we finally saw Hino without his mask on, and we're now hearing Hino speak in actual sentences here. He looks over to Kamizumi and says, "Morning, sir." And I love Kamizumi's reaction to this. He looks so surprised and just says, "Huh, you can greet people, my boy, morning." And after this, we're then getting our first impression here of who Hino actually is without the mask on, but he seems to just look lost for the moment, right? He asks Kamizumi who he is specifically, but then he asks him to give him a moment to get a better understanding of the situation in full, and while Hino's taking this pause, Kamizumi figures that this is Hino's true form when he's finally without the mask on, but then suddenly we're seeing Hino realize he's actually in front of Oda, and he mentions just how old he looks now, seemingly in comparison to when he looked younger, of course, and then we're hearing from Hideyoshi. He's just ecstatic to see Hino finally back, and after looking at the bracket for Tenkaichi, he's able to figure out that he's been called to fight in the tournament. He says, basically, since Nobunaga's about to croak, I've been scouted out for a fight over who's gonna take over his domain, right? And then he goes back to talking to Kamizumi. He recognizes him as the Sword Saint before getting into the first flashback of the fight. And out of all the backstories in Tenkaichi so far, I have to say, I think Hino's is probably the most interesting we've seen yet, right? Like, it hits that sweet spot of feeling supernatural, but also coming off as generally realistic at the same time. So as we're getting into the first bit of his backstory, it starts off narrating with how he was born in the mountains of Hino, and he was apparently born with horns, able to stand just days after he was born, and could understand language in just a couple of months. Overall, he was extremely and unnaturally capable for his age, but throughout most of the backstory we get here during the time he lived with his mother still, it's important to remember that he's still just a kid, right? Or at least that's just how I understood him here as, because even though he looks so much older and doesn't have any issue with straight up fighting and killing off his opponents, it's not because he actually knows what he's doing. This is just the life he was raised into. And I'm not trying to justify him being this village's object of worship or anything. I'm just trying to paint the picture here for what we're meant to interpret him as. Because I think the Hino we see in this backstory after Oda recruits him versus the Hino we see during his time with his mother are meant to be seen as two different characters. But the backstory never really says how old Hino is by the time we see this village give their offerings to him and his mother. So again, it's very interesting how a lot of his backstory is left open-ended. We also never really hear much of his own thoughts either throughout this chapter, so I can see why some of you wouldn't necessarily like this as a backstory for him, but I'm sure there's a lot being said between the lines here that we'll see come to light throughout the rest of his fight. So then we're seeing him after he just fought in the sumo match, and instead of only fighting for the water rights of his village, he was also able to take an excess, meaning he also took the village's crops and money since no one could stop him. And right when it looks like his opponent is almost dead, he asks Hino for his name, and it's interesting because after he tells him, the dude just says, "How pathetic, you have such strength and yet your parents never even gave you a name. Since you don't understand people, your overwhelming strength is no different from the forces of nature." And it's even more interesting because before he says this, he acknowledges Hino as a little boy, so I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier about Hino being a kid throughout most of this backstory. And it's weird because this dying sumo fighter notices that, but he doesn't use Hino being a kid as an excuse for not understanding people. He just chalks it up to him being this unnatural force of nature. So then Hino just one-shots him to finally finish him off, and then we're coming to this part, and the art just looks so disturbingly good here. This shot looks like something you would see out of a horror manga. But as we're seeing it through Hino's perspective, he sees her as just pitch black with this fire behind her, and it's curious because when we see him tackle this lady in the next part of the chapter, he also sees her with this fire behind her. He even sees his mother again before he decides to let her go. And as this lady and her baby are running away, he overhears her call her baby Kosaku, and this leads into the next part of the chapter of him asking his mother for a name, because if you didn't know already, Onigami is just a title, Oni meaning demon and Gami meaning god, but as far as Hino knows, it's just his name more than it is a title, and we're seeing his mother rage again in pitch black with these flames around her again. And Hino thinks he did something wrong since he realizes this pitch black expression with black flames is meant to represent someone's anger or resent like the lady before. So you can see how he's gradually understanding how corrupt his own mother is, but he's also realizing that it's not because of his own fault. He's just asking for a name like the dying sumo from before had mentioned. But then they're interrupted by Oda, who coincidentally came looking for Hino. And like it was implied earlier, Oda looks so much younger here. He came to execute Hino as punishment for plundering the other villages. And this is really interesting interesting because it implies that Oda doesn't agree with how much Hino took from all the other villages, despite him winning it in sumo matches. So I guess it's because he took more than he was allowed to, right? Because then we're seeing his own mother throw him under the bus. She says it was Hino who's responsible, like it wasn't her who straight up raised him into living like this. And even though we don't hear much of Hino's own thoughts, you can see it on his face. He looks so stressed. This is the first time we've seen him look any different this whole chapter. And right when Oda tells his men to fire, we're seeing Hino again, but he's actually frowning this time instead of smiling. This is now the second time we're seeing him with a different expression than usual. And after Oda's men are done shooting, it turns out he survived even though his mother died, and this is where we get to how Oda took him in and gave him his Choco name. And then fast forwarding to 1579, we're seeing him during his time under Oda where he was able to go all out without being manipulated by his mother anymore. And then coming to the year 1590, just 10 years before the current timeline, we're seeing Hino and Hideyoshi with the mask for the first time here, and it turns out the purpose for the mask was to actually put him to sleep. And he decided to do this knowing that one day Oda would do something worth him taking his mask off for, which as far as we know is apparently fighting in Tenkaichi. And now cutting back to the fight, we're seeing Hino and Kamizumi staring each other down, and then Hino asks him for his name, or rather what he would like to be called. And after some dialogue, Kamizumi bows his head and says, "Bushin, the martial god, because I'm the strongest in the world." And after Hino takes a stance telling him to call him Onigami, he just lunges himself at Kamizumi. Kamizumi able to dodge him despite him fighting with his mask off now, but then using the top of the cage, Hino just rushes himself downwards at Kamizumi here. He even looks impressed, but after all of the dust settles, we're then seeing Hino crouching downwards ready to throw himself at him, and even though he dodges it, this straight up sends the cage flying in a whole other direction. And I love seeing Mori's reaction to this. It ends up crashing back to where they're not even fighting inside it anymore. And with the cage gone now, Hino then tries to hit him with a drop kick, but then somehow we're seeing Kamizumi behind him at this point. It's not even clear when or how he dodged. And then we're hearing from Kamizumi's student. He says, "It's open. It seems Sensei has recognized Choco." And coming to the end of the chapter, Kamizumi just looks at Hino with his eyes wide open. He's answering Hino after he asked him how he dodged. He says, "Then let me tell you why they call me Bushin." Alright, so it looks like we're getting into Kamizumi's backstory with the next chapter, but I could be wrong. It sounds like the next chapter is gonna get into the history of Kamizumi being called Bushin, but overall this was a really fun chapter, and I have to be honest, I think if the fight finishes keeping this level of quality in the writing, I'm almost positive this will end up becoming my favorite fight in the story so far. And I know a lot of you could disagree with me, but I just felt there were so many red flags for Hino in this chapter, right? It just seems like the chapter was simultaneously building the hype up for Kamizumi being this S-tier fighter. It wouldn't even surprise me if we don't even see him use his sword this fight. Again, I'm sure a lot of you Hino fans are gonna disagree, but please let me know in the comments how you all felt about what I had to say, anything you agreed or disagreed with. But that's gonna be the end of the video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. But before I end the video, I just want to give a very special thanks to the channel's patrons: Iron, Justin, Nix, EXP, Paranormal Beluga, and Jedi Knight 104. I can't say it enough, guys. Thank you so much for the support. And for anyone wondering, I just recently opened up a Patreon where if you're interested, you can sign up too and get into the monthly Q&A I'll be doing now here on the channel. I'll be posting the next one up sometime at the start of September, so feel free to consider joining. You'd also be helping me out a lot here in a massive way and get a special shout out like this in every single video. The link will be in the description below, or you could just search it yourself at patreon.com/Izanami. But other than that, guys, again, thank you so much for watching. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video. I would greatly appreciate it. And of course, if you're interested in more Tenkaichi, then make sure you subscribe. I'll be doing more here on the channel like always. And yeah, have a great day.